The morning air in Asheville, North Carolina carried that peculiar mountain chill that made even late spring feel like winter hadn't quite let go. Thomas Brennan stood in front of what remained of his grandfather's old cabin, a thermos of coffee in one hand and a crumpled set of architectural plans in the other. The structure was barely standing. Rotted beams, a collapsed porch, windows so fogged with age they looked like cataracts. He was 32, recently divorced, and holding on to this piece of land like it was the last solid thing in his life. Which, in a way, it was. The cabin sat on 5 acres his grandfather had bought in the 1960s, when this part of the Blue Ridge Mountains was still considered too remote to be valuable. Now, Asheville was booming, and developers called him weekly with offers he kept refusing. Thomas wasn't interested in selling. He was interested in rebuilding. He'd spent the last 6 months learning carpentry through YouTube videos and library books, saving every dollar from his job as a high school math teacher. His ex-wife Jennifer had called it a midlife crisis. His colleagues called it a hobby. Thomas called it survival. The plan was simple. Tear down what couldn't be saved, keep the foundation and frame where possible, and rebuild the cabin as a place he could actually live. Escape the rental apartment in town, the thin walls, the landlord who raised rent every year like clockwork. Out here he could breathe. But there was one detail in his plans that nobody understood. Thomas wanted the main windows facing west and north. Not south. Not east where the sunrise came. West and north toward the slope of the mountain and the dense tree line. When he'd mentioned it to his contractor friend Mike, the response had been immediate and harsh. "You're building the windows backwards, man. South-facing catches the sun all day. That's like building 101. You're gonna freeze in winter and waste money on heating. This is insane." Thomas had tried to explain. The mountain created a unique situation. The valley orientation meant that in summer, the western exposure would catch extended evening light. The north side, despite conventional wisdom, would receive reflected light from the rock face during specific months. He'd done the calculations, tracked the sun's path for weeks, analyzed the topography. Mike had laughed. "Tracked the sun's path? What are you, Galileo? Just build it normal, Tom. You're overthinking this." But Thomas couldn't shake what he'd observed. His grandfather used to sit on the old porch in the evenings, and Thomas remembered how the light seemed to last forever, painting the cabin in gold long after the sun had set on the eastern side of the mountain. Work began in April. Thomas took a leave of absence from school, cashed in what little remained in his savings, and started demolition. Mike agreed to help on weekends, though he made his skepticism clear every single time the window placement came up. By June, the frame was up, the walls were going in, and the windows were being installed exactly as Thomas had planned. Large panes facing west and north, smaller functional windows on the south and east sides. That's when the neighbors started talking. The Hendersons, who lived a quarter-mile down the mountain road, stopped by one Saturday afternoon. Bill Henderson was a retired builder, someone whose opinion carried weight in these parts. He stood looking at the cabin for a full minute before speaking. "Son, I've been building homes in these mountains for 40 years. What you've done here with these windows, it's backwards. You're gonna regret this come winter." Dark by 4 p.m., cold seeping through that north wall. "You've got time to fix it before the drywall goes up." Thomas felt his jaw tighten. "I appreciate the concern, Mr. Henderson, but I've done the math on this. The sun path here is different because of the valley and the rock face. I know it looks wrong, but doesn't look wrong, son. It is wrong." Bill shook his head slowly, that particular way older men do when they think young people are too stubborn for their own good. "You spent all that money and effort to build a dark, cold house. Shame." Word spread. In a community as small as this mountain area, unusual choices became dinner table conversation. The teacher who's building his cabin backwards. The guy who thinks he knows more than builders with decades of experience. The fool wasting his money on a dark house. Thomas heard it at the hardware store, at the post office, even from his own sister when she called. "Mom's worried about you, Tom. She thinks you're not thinking straight after the divorce. This window thing. People are talking. Maybe you should listen to the professionals?" He didn't change the plans. By late August, the cabin was finished. Insulation, drywall, trim, flooring. The windows gleamed, facing exactly where Thomas had insisted they should. And then he waited for September. September arrived with cooler temperatures and shorter days. Thomas moved into the cabin on a gray Tuesday morning, loading his truck with the minimal furniture he'd kept after the divorce. A bed, a table, 2 chairs, some kitchen basics. Starting over required traveling light. The first week felt like vindication in reverse. The cabin was darker than he'd expected in the mornings. The sunlight came late, filtered through the eastern windows he'd deliberately kept small. By 3 in the afternoon, shadows stretched long across the hardwood floors. Mike stopped by on day 5, bringing a 6-pack and a smirk that said everything without words. "So, how's the backwards mansion treating you? Getting your 4 hours of extra sunlight yet?" Thomas stood in the dim living room, unable to argue with what was obvious. "It's early September. The angle's not right yet. Give it time." Mike laughed, but it wasn't mean-spirited. It was the laugh of someone watching a friend learn an expensive lesson. "Tom, you're a good guy. Smart as hell with numbers and equations. But sometimes real-world experience beats calculations. You should have listened." After Mike left, Thomas sat alone as dusk crept in earlier than it would have in a south-facing home. Doubt crawled into his chest like cold water. What if they were all right? What if he'd spent $28,000, his entire savings, his grandfather's legacy, proving that stubbornness wasn't the same as vision? By the second week, the talk in town had shifted from curiosity to something worse. Pity. At the grocery store, Sarah Chun, who taught chemistry at the same high school, touched his arm with that gentle concern reserved for people making terrible life choices. "Hey Tom, I heard you finished the cabin. If it's too dark or cold this winter, you know you can always find a rental back in town. No shame in admitting when something doesn't work out." The hardware store owner, old Pete McKenzie, was less gentle. "Heard you're living in that backwards cabin now. My wife says you're gonna sell it by Christmas when you can't stand the dark anymore. I told her you'd make it till January at least. You always were stubborn." The words stung worse than Thomas wanted to admit. He'd spent months defending his vision, insisting he'd seen something others hadn't. Now, standing in a dim cabin at 4:30 in the afternoon, while the sun blazed somewhere on the other side of the mountain, he felt like the punchline to a joke everyone had predicted. His mother called on a Friday evening, her voice careful in that way mothers use when they're trying not to say "I told you so." "Tommy, your sister mentioned the cabin is pretty dark. There's no shame in selling it, honey. You tried something different. That takes courage. But sometimes we have to accept when we've made a mistake." Thomas hung up and sat in the growing darkness, watching the last of the daylight fade through his western windows. Tomorrow was September 21st, the autumn equinox, the day his calculations said everything would change. He just had to make it through one more night of doubt. Thomas woke at 5:30 on September 21st to complete darkness. He made coffee in the dim kitchen, the only light coming from the small east window above the sink. The doubt from the previous weeks sat heavy in his stomach, mixing uncomfortably with the caffeine. He'd been so certain. The calculations had been clear. The sun's path during the equinox, the angle of the mountain, the reflective properties of the granite rock face to the north. It had all made sense on paper. But paper didn't keep a house warm. Paper didn't prove you weren't a fool. By 9 a.m., thin sunlight filtered through the eastern windows, barely warming the living room. Thomas sat at his table, laptop open, pretending to work on lesson plans for when he returned to school. But his eyes kept drifting to the western windows, still shadowed, still dark. 10 o'clock. Nothing. 11 o'clock. Still waiting. At 11:47, something shifted. It started as a glow, subtle enough that Thomas almost missed it. The western window began to catch light. Not direct sunlight, but something else. Something reflected. The granite rock face on the northern slope was angling the morning sun back toward the cabin, just as he'd calculated. By noon, the effect was undeniable. Light poured through the western windows in a way that seemed to defy logic. The northern windows, positioned to catch the reflected glow from the rock face, added a second source of illumination. The cabin didn't just brighten, it blazed. Thomas stood in the center of his living room, turning slowly, watching light fill every corner. His hands were shaking. He'd been right. At 1 p.m., the cabin was brighter than any south-facing home could be at that hour. The dual light sources, direct western sun and reflected northern light, created an effect he'd only imagined in his calculations. No shadows in the corners, no dim hallways, just pure, sustained light. By 2 p.m., he knew he had to document this. He set up his phone on a tripod, recording the light levels, the way the cabin seemed to glow from within. At 3 p.m., when south-facing homes would start losing their light, Thomas's cabin was still brilliantly lit. The western sun was fully engaged now, pouring through those large windows everyone had called backwards. 4 p.m., still bright. 5 p.m., golden hour light filled the cabin like honey. 6 p.m., the sun finally began to set, but the extended exposure had given him nearly 7 hours of sustained, brilliant light, far more than the 3 hours a south-facing cabin would receive this time of year. If you're watching this and thinking sometimes the unconventional choice is the right choice, hit that subscribe button. Because what happened next changed everything in this small mountain community. Thomas sat in his glowing cabin as dusk finally arrived, pulled out his phone, and started making calls. The first one was to Mike. "You need to come see this. Bring your light meter. Bring your skepticism. Just bring yourself and see what I built." Mike arrived at 7 the next morning with his light meter, a notebook, and Bill Henderson. Word had traveled fast after Thomas's call, and apparently Bill wanted to see for himself whether the backwards cabin had somehow defied 4 decades of building experience. They sat in the dim morning light, coffee cups in hand, waiting. Thomas said nothing. He didn't need to explain anymore. The cabin would speak for itself. At 11:43, the transformation began again. Bill Henderson stood up from his chair, walked to the western window, then to the northern one. He pulled out his phone, took photos of his own light meter readings. His face shifted from skepticism to confusion to something Thomas had never seen before: respect. "I'll be damned." Bill's voice was quiet. "The rock face is angling the light, and that western exposure with the valley orientation. You're catching the sun's full arc. This shouldn't work, but it does." Mike was taking measurements, comparing them to readings from the previous day at his own south-facing house. "Tom, you're getting maybe 4.5 more hours of quality light than my place. In September. I don't even know what to call this." Thomas finally allowed himself to smile. "I call it listening to the mountain instead of the textbook." By that afternoon, Bill had called 3 other builders. By evening, 6 people were standing in Thomas's living room, watching the extended golden hour light pour through windows that everyone had called a mistake. Pete McKenzie from the hardware store was there, shaking his head in disbelief. "I told my wife you'd be selling by Christmas. I'm gonna have to eat those words with a side of crow." Sarah Chun arrived with her physicist husband David, who spent an hour analyzing the angles, the reflective coefficients, the topographical factors. "This is brilliant," he kept saying. "You essentially created a passive solar collector using natural geological features. Do you realize what you've done?" Thomas was beginning to. Within a week, the story had spread beyond the mountain community. A local newspaper ran an article, "Teachers' Unconventional Cabin Design Challenges Building Norms." The piece included photos, light measurements, and interviews with the builders who'd called him foolish. His phone started ringing. Architects from Asheville, a sustainable design firm from Charlotte, a professor from NC State's architecture program who wanted to bring students to study the cabin. But the call that mattered most came on a Thursday evening. It was Jennifer, his ex-wife. "Tom, I saw the article." Her voice was different than he remembered, softer, lacking the edge of frustration that had characterized their last year together. "I'm sorry I called it a midlife crisis. You were trying to tell me you saw something others didn't, and I didn't listen." Thomas looked around his bright, warm cabin. Sometimes we have to build things backwards before people can see them right side up. The mountain had taught him patience. The cabin had taught him trust. And the light, that impossible, beautiful light, had taught him that being right wasn't nearly as important as being true to what you knew. By mid-October, Thomas's cabin had become something he never intended. A case study. The architecture professor from NC State, Dr. Elena Martinez, had indeed brought her students. They spent 3 days measuring, photographing, and creating digital models of how the light interacted with the mountain topology. Your grandfather's land sits in what we call a geographical sweet spot, Dr. Martinez explained to Thomas and her gathered students. The valley orientation, the granite composition of the northern rock face, the elevation, it creates conditions that exist in less than 0.5% of mountain properties. You didn't just build a cabin, Mr. Brennan. You built a proof of concept. What concept? Thomas asked. That site-specific design trumps conventional wisdom every single time. That observation and calculation matter more than tradition. She smiled. That sometimes the backward way is the forward way. The sustainable design firm from Charlotte offered him a consulting position. They were working on a mountain resort project and wanted his input on passive solar design using natural geographical features. The pay was 3 times his teaching salary. Thomas turned it down. He liked teaching. He liked his students. But he agreed to consult on weekends, a compromise that brought in extra income without sacrificing what mattered. Mike stopped by on a crisp November Saturday with an apology and a proposal. I've got a client building on the western slope of Mount Pisgah. Similar topology to your place. Would you be willing to look at the site and tell me if your window magic would work there? Thomas grabbed his jacket. Let's go see what the mountain has to say. They began collaborating on 3 projects that fall. Each one involved unconventional window placement based on specific geographical analysis. Each one worked. Mike's reputation grew, and he made sure everyone knew where the innovation had come from. Bill Henderson did something even more unexpected. He showed up one afternoon with a handwritten letter. This is for my grandson. He's studying architecture at Clemson. I told him about your cabin and what I learned from being wrong about it. Bill's weathered hands held the letter carefully. I told him that 40 years of experience taught me how to build houses, but you taught me how to read the land. That's worth more than anything I learned in my career. Thomas read the letter, his throat tight. Bill had written about humility, about the difference between knowledge and wisdom, about a young teacher who saw what experienced builders had missed. By Thanksgiving, Thomas had dinner guests for the first time since the divorce. Mike and his wife, Bill and his wife, Sarah and David, Dr. Martinez and 2 of her graduate students. They gathered around his table as the extended evening light poured through the western windows, turning the cabin into a golden sanctuary. Bill raised his glass. To building backwards and seeing forward. Thomas looked around at the faces of people who doubted him, then supported him, then learned alongside him. The cabin had given him more than light. It had given him community, purpose, and proof that trusting your vision mattered, even when the whole world called it wrong. Especially then. 2 years later, Thomas stood in almost the same spot where he'd first held those crumpled architectural plans, but everything had changed. The cabin had aged beautifully. The wood had weathered to a rich patina, and the gardens he'd planted along the western side were thriving in the extended sunlight. Tomatoes in November, herbs that grew fuller than anywhere else in the county. His consulting work had evolved into something unexpected. He still taught math 3 days a week, but the other 2 days he spent analyzing properties across North Carolina, helping people understand their land before they built. His reputation had spread through word of mouth and a documentary that Dr. Martinez's students had produced about passive solar design. The film had won a Regional Environmental Innovation Award. Thomas had attended the ceremony in a borrowed suit, uncomfortable with the attention but grateful for the platform it provided. Mike's firm had tripled in size. They'd developed a specialty in site-specific sustainable design, and their waiting list stretched 8 months. Every project began the same way, intensive geographical analysis before a single conventional assumption was accepted. Bill Henderson had retired fully now, but he spent his free time giving talks at community colleges about the intersection of traditional craftsmanship and innovative thinking. He always mentioned the backwards cabin, always gave Thomas credit, always ended with the same line. Experience teaches you what's been done. Observation teaches you what's possible. Jennifer had remarried, and she'd sent Thomas a card last Christmas with a photo of her new house. We used your method, she'd written. Hired an analyst to study our land before we built. The eastern windows are smaller, the western ones catch the lake reflection. You were right about listening to the place instead of the plan. I'm happy. I hope you are too. Thomas was. On this particular October morning, he wasn't alone. A young couple stood with him, looking at the adjacent 5 acres he'd decided to sell. Not to developers, but to people who understood what the land was trying to say. The woman, an engineer named Patricia, held a tablet showing sunpath simulations. The man, a carpenter named James, was sketching window placements that looked unconventional but made perfect sense for the topology. Your cabin taught us to look first and build second, Patricia said. That's rare wisdom these days. Thomas smiled, remembering his own journey from doubt to vindication. The land teaches. We just have to be willing to listen. As they walked the property, discussing angles and light and the patience required to observe before acting, Thomas felt his grandfather's presence in the mountain air. The old man had known something special existed here. He'd sat on that porch watching impossible evening light, understanding without needing to prove it. Thomas had simply finished what his grandfather had started, trusting what you see over what you're told. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever trusted your vision when everyone said you were wrong, do me a favor, hit that like button, drop a comment about a time you built something backwards that turned out right, and subscribe to see more stories about people who dared to see differently. Your support means everything, and I'd love to hear what stories you want me to tell next. The mountain still stands. The light still pours through those backwards windows. And Thomas Brennan still wakes up every morning in a cabin that proved sometimes the best way forward is the way nobody else sees coming.